The wind moved low across the Claybridge Valley that morning, whispering not with threat, but with memory. The soil beneath Mrs. Laverne Miles' boots felt familiar, resilient, rich, and slightly damp from the rain 2 nights before. She stood still at the edge of her porch, coffee cooling slowly in a ceramic mug she hadn't changed in 15 years. Her eyes didn't blink often. They simply watched. At 68, Laverne Miles lived alone, but not quietly. Her presence hummed through every fence post, every row of greens in the east garden, every beam in the house her husband built long before the internet came and made even the silence feel loud. She didn't need many things, but she needed this land. She had inherited it from a grandfather she barely remembered. His photo still hung crooked in the hallway, but over the years she had memorized it in a way no surveyor ever could. Every acre carried a lesson, every ridge a warning. And lately, it had been speaking to her in strange tones. It started with the runoff. At first glance, it was nothing. Just a slight discoloration in the water draining down from the north slope. But Laverne noticed. She always noticed. Then came the smell, faint but chemical, rising after rainstorms like a whisper through the roots. Finally, the grass along the west edge stopped, growing altogether. Not died, just quit. She didn't panic. That wasn't her way. Instead, Laverne pulled her husband's old geological journal from the shelf behind the stove, the one with creased pages and a red ribbon worn thin. She flipped to a section she hadn't read in years: mineral content projections, fault lines, handwritten notes about unusual sediment shifts. His handwriting had always been neat, even in the margins. He'd suspected something long ago. Without a word to anyone, Laverne began her quiet mission. She gathered samples, filed paperwork, called in a favor from an attorney 3 counties east, a veteran just like her, who knew how to keep his mouth shut and his loyalty firm. She initiated the mineral rights claim under an alias. The whole thing on paper looked ordinary, but the land was never just paper to her. Weeks passed. Then the trucks came. At first, they idled near the main road, too clean, too still. Then they crept closer, crunching gravel like wolves testing the perimeter of a sleeping herd. They bore no logos, but the men inside carried themselves like authority wrapped in leisure. Button-downs rolled at the elbow, boots that hadn't seen mud, and smiles that seemed allergic to sincerity. The first one who dared step onto her porch introduced himself as Mr. Vale, said he represented a strategic land acquisition firm, said they admired her resilience and wanted to help her transition gracefully out of the burden of land management, said they respected her legacy. He handed her an envelope with gold lettering. She didn't open it. Not yet. She watched him talk, watched the subtle tension in his eyes when she didn't interrupt, watched the twitch in his jaw when she didn't offer him a seat, or coffee, or even a nod. He left with fewer words than he'd arrived with, and she didn't open the envelope until sunset. The number on the page was staggering, enough to retire twice, enough to tempt most, enough to make her wonder, just for a second, how they even knew what lay beneath. But Laverne didn't hesitate. She fed the offer to the fire, inch by inch, watching the flames curl around the zeros like they were nothing more than lies in ink form. No drama, no fury, just a decision. That night, as the cicadas began their quiet orchestra, she sat on her porch in silence. No lights on, no radio, just the distant creak of an old weather vane and the weight of a truth she could already feel sinking into the roots beneath her. Someone wanted her land, not for its view, not for its history, but for something that could be sold, stolen, extracted. They thought she'd be easy, alone, quiet. But they didn't know Laverne Miles had once fired a sniper rifle through desert winds so thick it could snap bone. They didn't know her stillness was not submission. It was strategy. They didn't know she hadn't buried her past. She'd trained it to wait, and now it was listening. 3 days passed before the next knock. It wasn't the kind of knock meant to announce itself with courtesy. It was the kind that lingered in the space between ownership and threat. Assertive, practiced. Laverne didn't answer immediately. She was watching from the side window, standing just behind the edge of the curtain, where the light didn't reach. The man outside was younger than she expected. Tan suit, open collar, clean-shaven but wearing a beard of calculation behind his smile. His boots were expensive, but he'd scuffed them just enough to look local. He waited exactly 30 seconds before knocking again, then turned and looked out across her land like he was already calculating square footage. She opened the door just enough to be heard. "You're trespassing," she said. The man turned, unfazed. "Ms. Miles," he said, smiling with teeth that didn't blink. "Name's Kalen Briggs. You've probably heard of me. I work with folks like you, legacy landowners, people who've built something special, but might be ready to move on." Laverne said nothing. Her silence was as sharp as a rifle sight. He filled it with the kind of words meant to sound respectful, but landed like rehearsal. "We're not here to force anything, just options, possibilities. Change is coming, with or without consent. We figured you'd rather benefit from it while you still can." He reached into his jacket and placed another envelope on the porch railing. This one was heavier, labeled "Final Offer." Still, she said nothing. Briggs's smile faltered, just a flicker, but enough to betray the expectation he had brought with him, that she'd be dazzled or softened, or at the very least intimidated. But Laverne Miles didn't blink. "You're wasting your time," she said flatly. "This land isn't for sale. Not now, not ever." Kalen's jaw tightened. "This isn't personal, just business." "You keep saying that like it'll make it true." A gust of wind swept through the trees behind her, and the smell of soil rose faintly in the space between them. The land was listening again. So was she. "2 weeks, Kalen said, retreating now, but not backing down. "That's how long you've got before this isn't a conversation anymore." She watched him leave, didn't pick up the envelope until the dust had settled. She didn't open it. This time she didn't even burn it. She slid it into a drawer beneath the sink and laid a cast iron pan on top. She preferred to know where her enemies kept their secrets. By the end of the week, the tone of the town had changed. At the gas station, the man who used to joke about the weather looked through her like glass. The grocery store clerk bagged her produce with a stiffness that said he'd heard something, but didn't want to be seen knowing it. It wasn't fear, it was distance. Manufactured, maintained. And then came the first cut. Her truck's tire, slashed cleanly near the sidewall, not enough to be noticed until it was too late, enough to kill someone on the highway. She didn't call the sheriff. She took out her field notebook and logged the time, the tread marks in the mud, and the placement. Then she changed the tire in silence. 2 days later, her water line burst. Too clean a break, not corrosion, not age, a cut, precise, deliberate, surgical. The night after, one of her goats collapsed, mouth foaming, eyes dull. Poison. That was the moment the line was crossed. Laverne didn't cry. She didn't curse. She buried the goat herself, far from the others, under the old cypress tree, where her husband once promised to plant fruit trees they never got around to. Then she descended into the storm cellar beneath the pantry and unlocked the case she hadn't touched in a decade. The rifle was still there. Wrapped in oilcloth, every piece was maintained out of ritual. She assembled it without thinking. Muscle memory answered where grief had once tried to interrupt. She calibrated the scope, loaded the magazines, strapped the sidearm to her hip. By dawn, she wasn't a landowner anymore. She was back on patrol. The fields weren't crops. They were terrain. Her porch wasn't a front step. It was an outpost, and her silence wasn't fear. It was readiness. They thought she didn't know war. But she was at war, with roots, and war never sleeps. The morning air carried the scent of turning soil and distant rain, a reminder that not all warnings come with thunder. Laverne Miles moved through her land like memory incarnate, her boots soft on the dirt, her breath measured, controlled. There was no fear in her gait, only calculation. She was done reacting. Now she would prepare. The first thing she did was walk the perimeter, alone, with nothing but her compass, a carpenter's chalk line, and the old military-grade field notebook she used to call her ghost ledger. Every corner of her land became a coordinate. Every fence post, a mark. She measured distances, noted visibility, and logged elevation changes. To anyone watching from a distance, she looked like a farmer tending lines. But she wasn't measuring for planting. She was measuring for fire. Underneath the east barn, buried beneath a false feed bin, lay the rest of what she needed. Her husband's tin lockbox. The code took a second. Her hands remembered what her mind didn't. Inside, handwritten field maps, seismic readings, and a laminated survey annotated with a cipher only the two of them had ever known. He had known, years before the landmen came with smiles and paperwork, he had already sensed something stirring beneath the surface. Contracts signed too quietly, trucks moving through the back roads too often, files disappearing from county records. He had tried to slow them down with red tape and outdated maps, thinking it would buy them time. And maybe it had, but they hadn't forgotten her. They just waited for her to be alone. Now they thought she was. That night she didn't sleep. She walked the fields by moonlight, listening not to what was there, but to what wasn't. No crickets near the north edge. No owl calls over the southern ridge. Nature was holding its breath. They were coming again. She called Isaac. He picked up on the third ring. His voice was rough with bourbon or exhaustion. Probably both. "You back in the game?" he asked. No preamble. "I never left," she replied. "You need scans?" 4 square miles, heat signatures, movements near the creek bed. "I want everything crossing timberline." There was a pause on his end, not hesitation but the weight of understanding. "You expecting a siege?" "I'm expecting a mistake," he exhaled. "I'll send you the stitched grid. Old Noah backup. Should be clean." "Make sure it is," she said. "If they're watching my land, they're watching everything." Another pause, then, "You alone?" "I'm enough." Isaac didn't argue. He never did. "Check your inbox tomorrow." By dawn, the silo was clean. It hadn't been touched in years, just rust, cobwebs, and the faint smell of grain from a season long gone. But the frame was stable. She reinforced it with sandbags, lined the floor with blackout tarps, and cut down in the guest room mattress to fit in a crawl space. She mounted her rifle in the loft, adjusted her scope, and ran drills in her mind. Approach angles, line of sight, choke points. This was not paranoia, it was rhythm, a muscle she hadn't stretched in years, now flexing with quiet precision. She knew how they'd come. First, the scout cams. She found two. One near the old oak tree, barely visible unless you were trained to spot glints off glass. The second wired into the false knot of a hickory trunk. The first she smashed. The second time, she rewired. Let them watch yesterday's footage on an endless loop while today's reality unfolded out of frame. The third night, they returned. She heard them before she saw them. SUVs creeping with lights off, tires humming too smooth for gravel. She watched from the silo, eye pressed to the scope, finger loose on the trigger. 3 vehicles, 9 men. She counted their shadows, measured their stride, listened for rank in their silence. This wasn't muscle. This was military. They thought darkness would hide them. They thought silence would protect them. They thought a lone woman in an aging farmhouse couldn't outthink, outpace, or outshoot them. They hadn't read her file. They didn't know about Kandahar, didn't know about the convoy she stopped with one shot, or the insurgents she tracked for 3 days through a salt flat without food. They didn't know the ghosts they were charting already knew where they would die. She whispered the old phrase, the one her husband used to say just before a mission. "Stand quiet, see far." And then she exhaled and waited. The first sound was not boots or breath or even the low thrum of engines, and it was the quiet click beneath the floorboards, barely more than a whisper. One of the tripwires had been tripped. Laverne Miles lay prone in the loft of the silo, the cool metal of her rifle pressed against her shoulder, cheeks snug to the stock, eyes scanning the scope's circular frame like it was a clock counting down to something terrible. 3 vehicles, 9 men. She had watched them fan out across the gravel and into the brush. Their movements were fluid, calculated. They didn't speak. Their formation was staggered but precise. The kind you don't learn from bar brawls or backroom threats. This wasn't muscle for hire. This was a unit. They were here for resolution. But they hadn't earned it. The first man stepped through the cattle gate without checking the shadows. She waited until his foot hit the second wooden rail, where she'd carved a barely visible notch. It was just enough to mark the distance, just enough to guarantee precision. She fired. The bullet caught him just beneath the clavicle, exiting clean through the upper back. He folded silently, a bag of meat and panic crumpling to the ground. No scream, no warning. The second man died 2 steps later, his ribs punctured by a round that dropped him onto a mine rigged from an old fertilizer drum. The explosion was low, not loud enough to echo, but sharp enough to fracture the air. Shards of stone and steel flared upward. Somewhere in the darkness, a voice shouted, "Sniper!" Panic always starts in the throat. They scattered, wrong move. She had designed it that way. The terrain funneled them, invisible barriers formed by brush piles and fence rows, pushing them toward bottlenecks marked by her chalk lines days earlier. She slid from the silo in silence, belly to wood, never lifting her silhouette. Her feet hit the soil and she moved fast and low through the irrigation trench she had deepened by hand. Mud clung to her knees. Her breath was slow, focused. In the distance, their rifles spat fire into the dark, shooting at shadows, at wind, at ghosts. They weren't trained for this. Not for a war born of patience and fury, and the kind of grief that doesn't cry anymore. It just sharpens. She reached her second nest near the old hay barn. The scope found a man mid-sprint. She took his leg first, clean through the thigh. He dropped into the ditch, trying to crawl, whispering something like a prayer. She didn't wait for the amen. Another flare burst near the southern fence. Tripwire, propane, a burst of white fire that lit the brush like noon. 2 more men were exposed. One she tagged on the chest, the other ran. They always ran. She rotated through 2 more nests, each stocked with supplies. Water, ammunition, hand-scratched maps on wooden planks. Her shoulder burned from the recoil, her joints creaked with fatigue, but her aim never wavered. By the time the trucks reversed, tires screeching, dragging blood and confusion behind them, she had already circled back to the house. But they had been ready for that too. She saw it the moment she reached the porch. The door cracked open. The lock wasn't broken. It had been picked. Quietly. They were already inside. Laverne slipped through the utility entrance, crouched low behind the coat rack. Her sidearm was out, gripped tight, her breath a measured rhythm beneath the rising tempo of adrenaline. Her home was now hostile ground. The first man moved through the kitchen, flashlight swinging, rifle low. She let him pass. A second entered through the window and stepped onto a rug she had rigged with roofing nails punched upward. His scream was brief, pain more than fear. That was all she needed. She struck the first man from behind, elbow to the weapon arm, pistol to the face, blade to the throat. He dropped like a marionette cut from its strings. The third attacker opened fire too late. A bullet grazed her shoulder, but not her resolve. She rolled behind the dining table, tossed another flare, and used its glow to shoot him in the knee, then finished the job up close. By the time she reached the hallway, the last man was already stepping through the rear stairwell. She waited beneath the bookshelf. As he passed, she yanked the cord on the swing lamp. His eyes flicked upward, and in that breath of distraction, she drove her knife straight through the shade into his chest. Silence returned, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy one, the kind that settles after a storm and knows more is coming. She had fought them off, but this was only the first wave. The sun broke over Claybridge, slowly and reluctantly, as if even the sky was uncertain what it might find below. Smoke drifted lazily from the fields, not from fire, but from the heat left behind. The land didn't look like a battlefield, but it remembered. Laverne Miles stood at the top of her porch steps, sweat drying on her brow, blood, hers and others, stiffening the sleeve of her shirt. She didn't move for a long time, just listened. The fields were quiet now, not with peace, but with aftermath. 3 of them were still alive. 2 lay tied behind the west fence line, stripped of their weapons, their faces caked in blood and disbelief. The third, Kalen Briggs, was inside, unconscious, a ragged line of crimson trailing behind him on the floorboards. She had zip-tied his wrists after driving the knife handle into the side of his head. He hadn't seen it coming. None of them had, because none of them had known who she was. Now they would. By mid-morning, Laverne had moved the 3 into the barn. It wasn't a place of torture. It was a place of memory, fortified days ago, not for cruelty, but clarity. Reinforced chairs are bolted to the concrete. Water bottles are just out of reach. A single hanging bulb swinging like a pendulum of reckoning. She let them sit for an hour. No questions, no threats, just time. Then she pressed play. The recorder clicked on. Her voice, their voices, the gunshots, the commands, the panic, all captured, filed, time-stamped. Evidence, not vengeance. When the tape ended, she spoke. You came here to erase me. You failed. One of the younger men cracked first. Sweat was running down his temples, a tremble in the voice. I'm not dying for this, he muttered. She leaned forward, calm. Then tell me who is. And he did. Not names, not exactly, layers. Orders came from companies with no owners, shells, LLCs. The man in the suit? Just a middleman, Kalen Briggs, sent to sweet-talk landowners, and when that failed, to sweep them out of the way. Sheriff Donald Price, he was the anchor, the gatekeeper, the one who delayed Laverne's filings, passed false reports to state offices, and ensured the paperwork never caught up to the plan. Her mineral claim? It was never supposed to go through. The moment it did, she became a liability. Same as her husband. She pulled out the folder, his old maps, the drone photo showing Kalen at a land auction years earlier, the coordinates circled in red. She watched Kalen's face, saw the flicker. Not fear, but recognition. You thought no one saw you. He did, she said quietly, and you killed him for it. Kalen didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. That evening, Laverne made 3 copies of the audio files. One she sent to a local newsroom, another to a state legal watchdog, the last to a former federal prosecutor who once called land seizures the polite face of war. Then she made a call. Mariah Knox, said the voice on the line, young, sharp, no nonsense. You don't know me, Laverne replied, but you've been tracking my land. Within an hour, they had a plan. Mariah would take the case public. Emergency injunction, whistleblower protection, civil RICO if they had enough names. And Laverne had plenty. When the story broke, it broke hard. Raids swept across 3 counties. Sheriff Price was arrested at the county line, trying to cross state borders with a suitcase full of burner phones and forged IDs. Kalen Briggs cut a deal, gave up names, accounts, and meeting logs. Officials resigned, board members disappeared. And the energy companies? They bled money, fast. Laverne never gave a public interview. She turned down podcasts, profiles, and documentary offers. When a journalist asked if she wanted to inspire the next generation, she smiled with just one corner of her mouth. I don't want to be a story. I just want my land. With the settlement funds, she established the Miles Land Trust, a nonprofit dedicated to defending Black-owned farmland from forced acquisition and buried fraud. No fanfare, just paperwork and permanence. Final scene. On a quiet morning, Laverne walked the edge of her highest field with her cane tapping the ground beside her. Bullet, her dog, chased the wind in the tall grass. She paused at the old gravestone beneath the sugar maple where her husband lay. She placed a small flash drive beneath the stone. Not for revenge, not even for memory, just closure. They thought I'd fold, she whispered. But you married a sniper. She stood, turned, and walked back home. Message of the story. Never underestimate a quiet woman, especially one who remembers everything and has nothing left to lose but the truth. Let me know if you'd like a version translated into Vietnamese or expanded into screenplay format.